Hello everybody and welcome to my final video about Assassin's Creed Valhalla. It is of course my usual verdict and discussion video where I will share my thoughts on the game. But before I start with the actual verdict and discussion, let me give you a quick schedule update. I did post this already on the community tab of my channel page, but in case you haven't seen that, this is what you can expect on my channel starting next week. First of all, I will be taking 2 days off, since both of my Let's Plays ended at exactly the same time. I literally recorded the final episodes for both games on the same day. So there will be no video on Monday and Tuesday next week. And then on Wednesday, which is November the 1st, I will start Cyberpunk 2077. And the day after, on Thursday, November the 2nd, I will start Fallout 3. So these are going to be the 2 games on my channel for, well, the foreseeable future. So I hope you're looking forward to that. Now, let's start with my discussion of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the longest Assassin's Creed game on my channel so far, and probably for a while. As I mentioned, I will not jump right back into the next Assassin's Creed game because I think I need a bit of a longer break now. And even though I skipped like 2 major DLCs for Valhalla, it still has a few more episodes than Odyssey, which was like the longest until now, I believe. I think Origins was almost as long, but again, I played all the DLC for Origins. Anyway, as always, I will start by talking a little bit about just the main production topics like audio, visual, gameplay, and so on. And then I will get into story writing and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, in terms of like the audio and visual production quality of the game, there isn't really that much to say because they have really perfected that at this point, and they still managed to improve it like a little bit each time. I think in this game the most notable improvement was more dynamic weather and lighting system, which actually looked pretty neat. The landscape was even more vertical than before. I mean, we had obviously like mountains and hills before, but it seemed specifically impressive in this game. We had like rolling hills and you could see very far into the distance until the ocean, and it looked really great. So there isn't really much to say about that. They really know how to design these great open world environments by now. And considering that all of the game, well, most of the game took place in, a fairly small area of, eastern England, it actually looked pretty diverse as well. And then obviously we had Norway and then all the mythological places like Asgard and Svartalfheim and so on. But they certainly managed to make the most of what seemed to be a fairly homogeneous setting of, just one country. But they did the same for the previous games as well, so I guess this is not a surprise. Speaking about the setting itself, maybe, at first it might be a little bit surprising that a game about Vikings is not set in, Scandinavia or maybe Iceland or whatever, but in England. It feels a little bit like, making an Assassin's Creed game about ancient Egypt and then setting it in Ptolemaic Egypt instead of like quote-unquote proper ancient Egypt. But I can understand why they did it, and I think they did it for the same reason why they set Origins in Ptolemaic Egypt, because first of all, there is a bit more, historical information than for like the old kingdom of Egypt or 9th century Scandinavia. I mean, yes, sure, we have some historical records on that, but it's a bit more well documented in England, so they had a bit more historical context to work with. And they just had the option to include a lot more diverse settings and peoples and so on. So we not only have like the Vikings and the North and the Danes and whatever, but the Saxons and the Celts and even some Franks and well, we have all these ancient Roman ruins scattered all over the landscape. As I mentioned before, they certainly exaggerated the presence and the scale of the Roman ruins in England. But, you know, I see why they did it, to add a bit more flair and diversity to the landscape. And, you know, it creates this melancholy atmosphere of lost glory, which is always pretty neat. So I see why they did it, even though it's probably not very historically accurate. And I assume that's also the reason why they set origins in Ptolemaic Egypt, because first of all, it's pretty well documented, and they had the chance to include like Greek people and Roman people and, you know, not just Egyptians. So it kind of makes sense. And, you know, in the end, they managed to give us a very detailed and lively portrayal of medieval England under Viking rule. Now, I would still say that when it comes to the amount of detail and the amount of visual storytelling, I think none of the games, that is neither Odyssey nor Valhalla, really managed to surpass Origins. Again, this might just be my bias speaking, but Origins had a lot of really neat details, you know, stuff that only happened in one particular place and didn't really have anything to do with the main story. It was just there as, you know, background flair. And while Odyssey and Valhalla are certainly very detailed as well, I think Origins still is the gold standard in that regard. But still, that is really just nitpicking. There isn't really anything that I would complain about in terms of the visual quality of the game. Same for the music. I actually like the music a little bit better than in Odyssey. I guess it's also partially due to the involvement of Einar Selvig, who I admire quite a bit. So music was very nice. The voice acting was great. So again, in terms of the general production quality, there isn't really anything that I could criticize. So maybe let's just move on to the gameplay. I think that I probably enjoyed the gameplay, as in like the combat system, a little bit more in Odyssey. They didn't really change a lot, but the things they did change wasn't really anything that I cared about for that much. Like the addition of stamina seemed more of an annoyance than anything. I think maybe they wanted to encourage a more, I don't know, aggressive fighting style, since you gain stamina for attacking, at least like the light attacks, but you lose stamina for evading and for blocking, which feels counterintuitive because, I mean, yes, attacking is more aggressive, but it's also like the most basic combat function that you have. It's just clicking, 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 whereas evading and parrying actually is like a small degree more involved and complicated, because you have to time it correctly and you have to decide which to do in which situation. So it feels that this shouldn't be punished by losing stamina, whereas just spamming the button gives you stamina. I mean, you still have to hit the target, I believe, but, you know, it's still weird that the slightly more complicated action, which is evading and parrying, has a punishment of stamina, and just stabbing does not. So I didn't really feel it added anything to the combat other than being annoying. Of course, in most battles it didn't really matter much. It was mostly during the longer boss battles where it could become a problem. And the other addition that I didn't really care for is that skills are kind of random because you have to find them in skill books and you can't just pick them from, a skill tree or whatever. As in like the active abilities. Of course, there is a skill tree with like passive abilities, but the ones that you can actually use in combat, you have to find in skill books. I'm not sure if the skill books are randomized or if they are all in specific predetermined locations, but there's still an element of randomness to it because you don't know what a skill book will give you until you actually found it. And if it is random, it is very reminiscent of the bone charms in Dishonored. And if you have watched that Let's Play, especially Dishonored 2, you may remember that there was like one skill that I wanted, just that one skill. I think it was the one that significantly increased the speed of the non-lethal takedown. And I think it was like the second to last bone charm in the game that I found when the game was almost over. It wasn't really that bad in this game since, there's quite a few skills that are similar to each other, lots of stabby attacks with your axe. I mean, there's only so much you can do with your axe. So it's not that I really missed a specific attack, but, it's always a problem if the skills you get are randomized and you can't actually build your own, skill set as you want because you haven't found the book yet. Of course, I suppose they did it to encourage exploration, so there's that. But other than that, the gameplay, the combat was fine. It's fluid, it works. I don't have any major complaints, but I like the one in Odyssey maybe a little bit better. Maybe another word on the relation between stealth combat and melee and open battle combat, because that is clearly a thing that has increasingly shifted towards open combat since Origins. In Origins, we had a few mandatory boss battles, and very rarely you would meet like a very strong random enemy in the open world that you couldn't assassinate. And in Odyssey, we already had quite a few of those. And in this game, obviously, I think the amount of actual mandatory open combat was even larger. But it also makes kind of sense since, Ava is not an assassin. She didn't even want to wear her hidden blade hidden because she felt it was like dishonorable. So it makes sense that, she would prefer actual combat. I still try to do missions stealthily whenever I could, simply because I felt, it's an Assassin's Creed game, so I should be stealthy at least sometimes. And there was a good amount of, combat that you couldn't really avoid. So I tried to use the stealth options when it was optional. But like I said, since this is a game about Vikings, I think they kind of had to, include a lot of actual combat and not just stabby stuff. And I suppose the next game, Mirage, will probably be more of a stealth game again. So those people who were always saddened by this shift towards combat versus stealth will probably like that one better. I also gotta say, I do like the fact that they didn't try to sanitize the Vikings completely and just make them some, heroic travelers or whatever. But no, you actually had them raid literal monasteries and so on. I mean, granted, the monasteries were always filled with soldiers, and obviously we would never actually target the civilians and so on, so it's a little bit, sanitized, but they didn't, skip that part of being a Viking completely. So I thought that was actually pretty good. It did, of course, sometimes create a bit of, let's say, cognitive dissonance when Ava, on the one hand, was like, yeah, let's go raid the Christ gold and let's kill for Odin and whatnot. And then the next moment she's all, oh, we're just here because we want to make allies and we want to bring stability to the country. There was a little bit of a disconnect between what Ava did in specifically like some of the side missions, and then she tries to be like a bringer of peace and stability in other situations. But I mean, the Vikings weren't just black and white. Yes, they did raid and pillage and steal and plunder. But they also were like people who just wanted to have a place to raise their families, and they wanted to trade and so on. So overall, I think it was a pretty balanced portrayal. They weren't just like plundering savages, but they were also not portrayed as like too sanitized and just heroic and whatnot. So maybe one final word on side activities in this game, because they added a few new ones, like the cursed symbols and so on. And I don't know, there weren't really any side activities that I thought were amazing. The cursed symbols, for example, had pretty basic gameplay, if you want to call it that. I did like the kind of atmosphere they added to the world, though, because they gave the world this sense of mystery and danger, and I kind of liked them just for what they represented more than what they added as a gameplay element. I also noticed that the world was a lot more like puzzle heavy than usual. So if you wanted to pick up a treasure, you usually had to find your way inside like a building by finding the right spot to shoot your arrow at the door or whatnot. And that got even worse in like the DLCs when you got all these different skills. I think that's also one of the reasons why exploring the map took longer than in previous games, because it just took very long to pick up a simple treasure because you always had to figure out how to get there. But yeah, I guess that's probably really all that I have to say in terms of gameplay and so on. Like I said, for the most part, this is all perfectly fine. They know how to write their Assassin's Creed games, and the overall world design and the gameplay is already at a point where any improvement is just very marginal, because there isn't really that much to improve anymore. So instead, let's go to the more narrative elements of this game. And before I start with the actual story, I want to say a few words on just the dialogue writing of the game, because that is actually something where I have to give them like a huge thumbs up. I really enjoyed the writing of the dialogues in this game, because it kind of sounded, Viking-y. I noticed very early in the game that they were using actual kennings, like, these poetic metaphors that you can find in Norse poetry. And they certainly stuck to it through the entire game. Especially Ava had a flair for poetry, which makes sense considering that she's a reincarnation of Odin, who is like the god of poetry. So, it's nice that they portrayed her not just as like some brute warrior, but, she had very good rhetoric talents, as we've seen. And I enjoyed that quite a bit. So yeah, the dialogue writing gets a huge thumbs up from me. Now, let's talk a little bit about the story in general. Now, one thing that is very noticeable about the story is how episodic it is. It has like these very, clearly defined chapters that have like a beginning and an end, and that are specifically like announced in the quest journal. This is like Act 1 of this chapter and so on. We had something similar before, but it was never quite as obvious. Clearly we had specific story arcs in previous games that lasted for a certain amount of time. But it was a lot more structured in this game, to a point where it almost reminded me a little bit of the very first Assassin's Creed game, where you had 3 or 4 main chapters that all functioned and were structured in exactly the same way. You came to a city, you went to your local Assassin's Bureau, And I remember that one of the guys in these bureaus was consistently grumpy for some reason. I don't remember his name. And then you had to do some reconnaissance, I believe, and, synchronize the viewpoints and so on. And then eventually you had your actual assassination. It wasn't quite as same-ish in this case, but it was similar. You came to a place, and then first you had to, find out what the problem is. Who are the people in charge here, and they would tell you, well, this is our problem, and first you have to do some preparations for it, like, destroy some cards or steal some stuff or free some people. And then it usually ended in like a siege or a boss battle or something like that. So it was very episodic, and the different episodes all kind of seem to follow a very same structure. Now, I will say this, a lot of these chapters were actually pretty good. And this specific, structure, whatever you want to call it, also gave them the possibility to properly introduce the characters and what's going on. And they had quite a few of interesting characters in these different chapters. And they, for the most part, gave you reason to care about these characters. So I wouldn't really criticize the very orderly structure of these different chapters per se. However, I will say this, I think there were too many of them. Like I said, this is the longest Assassin's Creed game that I've played so far. And the thing is, and that is interesting, that a lot of it is actually from what we would call the main story, the stuff that you actually have to play to finish the game. And the side content, like these world events and whatnot, they were usually finished pretty quickly. For the most part, each of these chapters took me about 4 episodes to finish. And one of these was like for the side content. Now, I wouldn't normally complain about a game having too much main story as opposed to side content. However, the thing is that a lot of these so-called main stories didn't really relate to the main story. If you want to count the, conflict between Sigurd and Eivor and the whole thing with Tyr and so on, if you want to consider that the red thread main story of the game. Yes, every now and then one of these chapters was focused on what I would say is the main plot of the game, but a lot of it is not. So it's interesting in itself, but it kind of feels more like a very extended side quest that is not optional but mandatory. You have to play it if you want to finish the game. And I think that's why this game can feel so long and a bit of a slog at times, because I said in Odyssey, yeah, the game is long, but I wouldn't say it's too long, because, if you don't want to spend that much time on it, you can just skip some of the side content. In this game, this is significantly harder because, yes, there is side content, but it doesn't really add much to the overall length of the game. But it's mostly these different chapters of the main quest that don't actually progress the main plot. Now, I can kind of see what they were trying to do here. Yes, the story of Sigurd and Eivor and the gods and, Basim's involvement in this is kind of the main plot, but they also want to focus a lot on this aspect of building a new home, building up Ravensthorpe, building alliances, and so on. So you might argue that this is the actual main story, but it's not really like a consistent, continuing story as such. It's, chapters of a larger picture. So I feel some of these chapters probably could have been scrapped without compromising the overall story arc. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe let's talk a little bit about the actual main story, which is, I would say, the relationship between Eivor and Sigurd, and which is, I would say, the relationship between Eivor and Sigurd and their relation to the Isu as being, reincarnations of gods, so to speak. I actually kind of like that one. First of all, as I've mentioned many times before, I do kind of like family-centered stories, so I always have like a weak spot for stuff like that. And I also like the mythological stuff, so this was kind of mixed together. So yeah, I liked the main plot, but it was moving so slowly on account of having so many other main quests in between that didn't really add to this. So I wish they had focused a little bit more on the main story, which I thought was actually pretty good. Also, I think in addition to like the Sigurd Eivor story, they could have made the whole Sons of Ragnar story like a B plot, so to speak, which they did heavily at the beginning of the game. You know, the whole story with Eva and Shelbert and so on. But after that, it feels that the different chapters became less and less connected to, some kind of coherent plot. So I feel if they had mostly focused on, Sigurd and Eivor and maybe like the whole, Sons of Ragnar story, it would have worked a little bit better. And you have probably noticed that at the end when you could gather your allies for like the final assault, I had to think really hard who these people were, what I did for them and where they came from. I actually wanted at some point revisit some of my old allies because, they kept sending me letters and said, hey, you should come here and see what we did. The reason why I didn't do it is honestly because I couldn't really remember where I had to go for which person. It just started to blend in a little bit too much at the end. Even though, like I said, the characters actually got some decent exposition for their specific chapters, but it was just too many of them. Also, another part of the main story that I should probably mention is that there are like decisions and some of them, I believe, will affect the ending between Eivor and Sigurd. Basically, if you're very confrontational towards Sigurd and just generally, do not support him, the ending between them will be like less amicable. And I believe that I, for the most part, did pick like the quote-unquote supportive options. I think there was one where I didn't, and that's when I kinda contradicted him in his very harsh verdict against, what was his name, Holger, the bard, or the artist. I think that was one time where I, stood up to Sigurd, but for the most part I was supportive of him. I didn't sleep with his wife, that was also apparently something that would be counted in my favor. Maybe a word on the romances in general in this game. It feels that they were kind of trying to set up Randvi as like a, main romance, and were kind of trying to lure you into that. But in the end, it still came a little bit out of nowhere. I did talk about it when the scene happened between Randvi and Eivor. It didn't completely come out of nowhere because Randvi certainly did send certain signals before. The thing is, it came kind of out of nowhere for Eivor because you didn't really have any options to interact flirtily with her before, until that very moment when you had to make a decision whether you wanted to pursue this romance or not. So it would have been nice if there had been more flirty interactions or options for that before that. But in the end, it was just, suddenly Randvi confesses her love to you, and you can either say yes or no, but it came a little bit out of left field at that moment. The other romances are more or less like they were in Odyssey, so not very consequential, with the exception of a few of them. Well, Petra definitely, at least she's like living in the same place, and you can come to her and, you can pursue certain activities, which was a nice touch. It was not like a very, you know, well-developed romance story, but, you know, it was more than we had in Odyssey, for example, where pretty much all the romances were just like one-night stands, except the one that you didn't choose in the DLC, but that's a different story, obviously. So certainly in terms of romances, they have room for improvements, because for the most part, they are kind of shallow. I feel that the Randvi one was supposed to be a little bit deeper, but it also just seemed like such a bad idea. And apparently it is a bad idea to start this relationship with Randvi while she's still married to Sigurd, because this will not go over well in the end. And I said as much during that scene. This is a game that is decision-based. This is something that will come back and bite me in the ass if I would go through with it. So I noped out of that option. But yeah, I can't really say how much other decisions affect the game, the outcome, because I would have to play it again, and I probably won't be playing it again just because it is far too long to play it another time. Finally, I think I would like to talk a little bit about the use of mythology in this game, because this is another thing that I thought was really well done. I did mention that I always enjoyed the mythological aspects of the newer Assassin's Creed games, because this is just generally a topic of interest to me. I feel that a lot of people do not agree with that assessment, but I really liked it. And I thought the way they integrated the Norse mythology into the Assassin's Creed lore was extremely well done. First of all, that first Asgard story arc is pretty accurate in terms of how they reproduce the elements from Norse mythology. I mean, yeah, they changed a little bit. They kind of combined different stories into one. So we had the one about the architect building the wall around Asgard, which in this case was kind of like a shield or whatever. And it was intertwined with some elements of a different mythology, the one where Thor's hammer was stolen and he had to disguise himself as Freya to get it back. And then obviously there was the one about the binding of Fenrir. But a lot of the elements were, you know, pretty accurate and pretty much taken one-to-one from the original story, and it still worked out. So I thought this was actually pretty impressive. Now, they certainly did take more creative liberty for the DLC, like I said before. For once, Baldur was not slain by Surtur or any Muspel or Jötna or whatever, but by his brother Hörder, who was tricked by Loki to do it. So that was clearly a huge departure from, you know, the accuracy of the first story arcs in Asgard. But I mean, I get it. If they would stick too close to the original myth, it would become kind of predictable, I suppose. Now, what I find interesting about these mythological DLCs is that they obviously open up the whole Isu lore significantly. For the first time, we have some confirmation that there's apparently like different groups or maybe nations of Isu, since the Aesir are clearly not the same Isu that we have been interacting with in Odyssey, for example. As a matter of fact, whenever one of the Greek-Roman Isu, let's call them that, appeared in this game, they were always portrayed as a Jötna, interestingly enough. So we had Hyrokin, who is Juno, right? And apparently Angreboda is Alethea. And I think Gunnlauda is supposed to be Minerva, which would mean that Suthunger is Zeus or Jupiter. So when Havi fought Suttungr, that was actually Odin fighting Jupiter. So that's something to wrap your head around. And I don't know, I think that's just a very interesting development for the overall Isu lore. Because until now, even when Isu appeared under different names, you could usually assume that they were still like the same Isu, like the Greek and the Roman, and apparently also the Etruscan ones, because very early in the franchise, sometimes the Isu were called by Etruscan names like Tinia instead of Jupiter and so on. So Tinia and Jupiter and Zeus are probably all the same Isu. There seem to be some notable exceptions, which is, for example, Aita. Aita is the Etruscan god of the underworld, so he is basically Pluto. And Pluto is Hades, but Hades is, as we've seen, a completely different person. So for the most part, these three religions seem to represent one Isu nation, which makes sense because they are very similar. I mean, Greek and Roman religion, partially because of a shared Indo-European heritage, but for the most part just because they have been influencing each other for centuries. Or well, mostly it's like the Greek religion influencing both the Etruscan and the Roman one. So at some point they became kind of similar. But obviously the North gods were too different to put them into the same framework. So apparently we have a completely different group of Isu here. And in their stories, the other group of Isu are presented as Jötnar. I've actually been wondering what that means for the other groups that are mentioned in these mythological DLCs. I mean, we can probably guess that the Vanir are a separate group of Isu, the Muspel as well. But what about the dwarves? Because the dwarves seem to, well, stand out a little bit, or more like the opposite, because they seem to be rather different than the other groups. Yes, Jötnar and Muspel and Aesir look different, but they seem to have like a similar level of power, for example. But the dwarves are very different. On more than one occasion, they specifically mention that the dwarves have like less hygge or whatever. So I have for a while even entertained the possibility that in these metaphorical representations, the dwarves are actually humans. I don't think they are, but hear me out. I think there is some case you can make about that, because first of all, they are smaller than the Aesir, and we have seen in Odyssey that humans are smaller than Isu. They seem to be doing mostly menial labor, like blacksmithing and mining and so on. And like I said, it's on more than one occasion it has been said that the dwarven hygge is kind of like inferior or whatever, which again would point to them being not Isu, and what other, life form or species would exist during that time other than, Isu and humans. And most importantly, probably, is that Havi/Odin specifically stated that he created the dwarves, or at least gave them like sapience, which is what the Isu did with humans. Engineered the evolution and made them sapient, Homo sapiens, right? So yeah, I don't know, I feel this can't be dismissed completely. Of course, what speaks against the dwarves being humans is that they seem to have too much freedom for that. I mean, they have like their own kings and their own nation. So unless the Aesir Isu treated their human servants significantly different than the Greco-Roman Isu, the dwarves are probably not humans because, they still seem to be mostly free people and not enslaved by the Aesir. Plus, we have seen what were probably actual humans in Jotunheim. As a matter of fact, a lot of the people living in Jotunheim were not actually Jötnar, but what looked like humans. Of course, you could argue that, yeah, they're humans, and they're presented like humans in Jotunheim in relation to the Jötnar, whereas the dwarves are also humans, and they're basically being presented as dwarves in relation to the Aesir, if you get my meaning. I honestly don't think that this is what they were trying to go for here, but it still raises a question: what are the dwarves supposed to represent? If they're not humans and not Isu, and they don't really seem to be Isu because they have like less power, so yeah, I don't know. It's certainly something to think about, right? But either way, for the most part, I really enjoyed these mythological stories, both for just their representation of the actual mythology and what they add to the overall Isu lore within the Assassin's Creed franchise. And finally, I feel I should probably also say a few words on like the real world story, you know, the one with Layla, which I think I completely forgot in my verdict video of Odyssey. But I mean, in my defense, it is very easy to forget about it, especially in this game where I believe only on 2 occasions they actually forced you out of the Animus, which was once at the beginning when you went to England, and then at the end for like the final confrontation. So, yeah, I don't know. As always, I feel they don't really know what to do with that story. They always seem to tease some stuff that's going to happen at the end of each game, but then in the next game, nothing really is done with that. So, yeah, I don't know. We'll see how they will develop this whole new direction with Basim / Loki being now the protagonist of the main story, and potentially Desmond being somewhere in a simulation and Layla being there now as well. Again, they've been setting up quite a bit of potential story ideas here, but they've done this before and they rarely ever do anything with it. So I guess we will have to wait and see if anything comes out of any of this. I feel they kind of have to do something with that now, you know, with Loki / Basim being in the real world now. That is kind of hard to ignore. But I guess we will see. And finally, maybe just a very quick thought on the franchise and its development in general. I know that a lot of people don't really enjoy the way that Assassin's Creed moved away from its roots of, you know, being stealth-based Assassin's game, and instead went for these large open world, more RPG-ish games. Now, personally, I did enjoy the change, because after, I don't know, 9, 8 Assassin's Creed games that all more or less followed the same formula, it was time for a change. Also, I enjoy open world RPGs, so I don't really have any issues with that. And I know that in addition to Mirage, which has already been released at this point, they are still developing more games. And I honestly don't mind that. I feel that there is a lot of potential in the Assassin's Creed franchise, simply based on the fact that they can choose between so many different historical settings. And as someone who is interested in history, I don't think I will ever get tired of it, because I will always look forward to explore this like new setting and what they do with it. I do wish sometimes that they would focus a little bit more on storytelling. Like I said, I like the story of this game, but it's being dragged out too much, and there's too much other stuff added to it, making it kind of hard to focus on like the main story. So I feel they should try to write stories that are a little bit more focused, and a little bit more compact, if you know what I mean. But I will most certainly return to the franchise at some point. Like I said, I do need a bit of a break for the time being. But I do want to play Mirage sooner or later. And whenever they come out with the next game in whatever setting they will pick for that one, I will probably jump into that one as well. And I will probably enjoy it just for being able to explore these historical settings. But I also understand that the setting alone cannot carry the game enough for everyone. So they should remember not to neglect actual storytelling and substance for, setting and atmosphere. But yeah, we will see how this franchise will develop in the future. Anyway, I hope I haven't forgotten anything that I wanted to talk about, but that should be pretty much it. Feel free to share your opinion on this. How did you enjoy this game in relation to, and are you glad that they are apparently returning a bit more to the roots for Mirage? But yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. So let's end this video here. Like I said, there will be 2 days off at the beginning of the next week. And on Wednesday, I will return with Cyberpunk 2077. So something completely different from the past. We will go to the somewhat near future. And I hope you're looking forward to that. But until then, I will say thank you for watching and see you again next time.